Hi, this is Mrs. Solomon, and this is our first screencast, our first lesson of the first unit, the Introduction to the Old Testament / Hebrew Bible. Our objectives during this lecture are stated right here. We're going to talk first of all about what is the Bible, and then we are going to talk about defining the Old Testament and defining the Hebrew Bible. There are differences, and we will discuss them here. We'll talk about those two canons and how they're organized, and then we'll talk about the difference between the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament and the Catholic and Orthodox Bibles. So those are our objectives during this lecture. Here's your relevant vocabulary that you need to know. This is basic vocabulary that you need to know in our introduction to the Hebrew Bible. So defining Bible, defining Scripture, Testament, Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, Canon, Apocrypha, Deuterocanonical, and the Septuagint. So let's get started. First of all, what is the Bible? The Bible comes from the Greek words ta biblia, which means the books. So we're not talking about a single gigantic work. We are talking about a collection of individual works, not written by one person, but written by a number of different people. The Bible contains scripture, which are authoritative or sacred writings that a faith tradition deems to be authoritative for their ritual, for their practice. And contained within the Bible are two divisions, the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now we're talking about the Christian Bible right now. We are not talking about the Jewish Bible. We are talking about the Christian Bible that contains those two divisions, because the Jewish Bible does not contain the New Testament. And finally, as we already learned, the Bible is the world's best-selling book. Whether or not it's read all the time is another story, but it is the world's best-selling book. Concentrating now on the first division of the Christian Bible, the Old Testament, and the only division of the Hebrew Bible, this section of the Bible is sacred to both Judaism and Christianity. And it took a very, very long time for these works to be compiled. It took over 1,000 years. Once again, then, it's an anthology, not a single book. And within that anthology of works, you got a number of different types of works contained within. You've got narrative, you've got legal code, you've got prophecy, you've got poetry and songs, wisdom literature, apocalyptic literature, all different types of literature. And then you have subgenres of literature. So you have genealogies and etiologies and eponyms, and you don't know what I'm talking about. We'll talk about all of that as we go on in the semester and through the academic year. The Hebrew Bible is the Bible known by Jesus, the apostles, and members of the early church, and in fact it is quoted quite often in the New Testament. So the Hebrew Bible was used quite widely in the first century in the development of the New Testament scriptures. Okay, so let's define the Old Testament specifically. Once again, it's the first section of the Christian Bible. Jews don't refer to this section of the Bible as the Old Testament. In fact, Old Testament is a Christian designation, and it's not because of age. It is not because it is ancient, although, yes, it is. But it serves to contrast the records of the early church, that testament that was written by the early church that describes the life of Jesus and the life of the early church. Testament, in fact, is a near equivalent, a near synonym, I should say, of the word covenant, that bond that God makes with humanity. And there are various covenants that are discussed in the Old Testament. So if we're talking about that bond, that is what the Old Testament describes. And so in this anthology of 39 separate works, you've got an account of God's work in the history of the people of Israel that illustrates that bond that he has with his people. Okay, so then what is the Hebrew Bible? The Hebrew Bible is an anthology of sacred texts or scripture written primarily in Hebrew, in the Hebrew language. And you can see an example of what the Hebrew language looks like right there to the right. There's a little bit of Aramaic, a few a few passages written in Aramaic, but the majority of the Hebrew Bible is written in Hebrew. The Hebrew Bible, of course, being the official written scriptures of Judaism, although there are other texts that are deemed as authoritative. It is an anthology of 24 works, although the same books that are in the Hebrew Bible are the same books that are in the Old Testament. Okay, now remember, there are 39 books in the Old Testament, 24 in the Hebrew Bible. How does that work if they're the same books? It has to do with the way some books were split in the Old Testament, and we'll talk about that very, very soon. Okay, so let's talk about these two canons, the canon of the Old Testament and the canon of the Hebrew Bible. Well, first of all, what is a canon? A canon comes from the Greek language, comes from a word meaning rule or measure, and is the authoritative list of sacred books or scripture that have measured up, notice that, measured up, measure, that's where canon comes from, measured up to the standards set by that community. So the Old Testament for Christians, specifically the Protestant Christian tradition, they established 39 books as authoritative for that tradition. And the way they're divided up in the Old Testament is in 4 divisions. The first is the Pentateuch, which is Greek for 5 scrolls. And there are 5 books in the Pentateuch: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Then you've got the historical books, and you don't need to know each one of these which books are in each section just yet. So just sort of take note. The historical books include in the Christian Bible Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and Ezra and Nehemiah. Then we've got this section of poetry and wisdom, of which the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job, those types of books are contained within that section. And then you've got the prophetic writings. And the prophetic writings in the Christian Bible are divided into the major prophets and the minor prophets, the major prophets being Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then you've got some 12 smaller books. So that's the Old Testament, 39 books. Those same 39 books are found in the Hebrew Bible, also referred to as the Tanakh. There are only 24 books contained within, but once again, they're the same books, they're just divided differently. So the first section of the Tanakh is Torah, which means law and instruction. It's not just strictly law. Then the second section is the Nevi'im. Torah is Hebrew for law and instruction. The Nevi'im is Hebrew for the prophets. And then the third section is the Ketuvim, which is Hebrew for writings. Now, if you take a look at the first letter of Torah, Nevi'im and Ketuvim, the T, the N, and the K, those make up what is in the word Tanakh. Here's the T, the N, and the K. So Tanakh is the same word that is used for the Hebrew Bible. Okay? And that specifically points to these 3 sections of that work. Okay, so I'll use the Tanakh, the word Tanakh, Hebrew Bible, Hebrew Scriptures. I'll use all of that interchangeably, although we're talking about the same thing. Okay, so we've talked about the canon, the Old Testament canon, the Christian canon. We've talked about the Hebrew Bible as a canon. But there is another canon, and that canon is referred to as the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha is a section in the Hebrew Bible. It's its own little separate section that it's a section that is authoritative in the Catholic and the Orthodox traditions, but are not authoritative in the Protestant Christian tradition, nor are they authoritative in Judaism. So you will not see these books contained within Protestant Bibles, nor will you see them contained within the Hebrew Bibles. This set of books are referred to as deuterocanonical. Deuterocanonical is a Greek word, deutero meaning second, and then you've got canonical referring to the canon. So essentially it's sort of like a second canon to the Old Testament. It comes from also the word apocrypha also in the Greek means hidden books. These are works that are composed after those books in the Hebrew Bible that were written that are contained within. Those books, the last book in the Hebrew Bible was written around the 2nd century CE. The books in the Apocrypha were written thereafter, and that is one of the reasons why they are not included in the Protestant Christian Old Testament nor the Hebrew Bible, because the later the books are, the less authoritative they are deemed to be. But they are very, very valuable books. There's a lot of wonderful information contained within, and we'll take a look at those books at another time. The Apocrypha contains books that are incorporated in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, and that Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible is referred to as the Septuagint, abbreviated Roman numeral 70. And so the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible contains more books. And once again, these are books that are authoritative in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, but not in the Protestant Christian or Hebrew Bible or Hebrew traditions. Let's talk a little bit more about the Septuagint. The Septuagint, once again, is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. Why did that have to happen? Well, you'll learn from the lecture that has to deal with the history of the people of Israel that with the conquest of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE, when he brought along Greek culture and Greek language and Greek everything, what ended up happening was the Jews began to speak Greek, and the use of Hebrew began to fall out of use. And so specifically for the early Christians in the Greco-Roman Empire, that translation was specifically used by them because Greek became the common language of the empire and Hebrew fell out of disuse. Where did that word come from, the Septuagint? It's from the Latin for 70. There's a tradition, there's a legend that 70 or 72 elders were commissioned in the 4th century BCE to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. And the legend is that these 70 or 72 scholars were placed in rooms independent of one another. And once they finished translating, and they started with the Torah, once they finished translating the Torah, they all came out, they compared the translations, and voila, all 70 or 72 translations were exactly identical. Okay, so that's the legend of the Septuagint. Used by early Greek-speaking Christians, it became the basis of the Christian canon. And so the books from the Apocrypha come specifically from the Septuagint. I don't know if that makes much sense, and we'll go through that in class. The books from the Apocrypha, because the Septuagint has a larger set of books, the books from the Apocrypha come straight from the Septuagint. So that is just a brief introduction to the Old Testament. We talked about what the Bible is, what the definition of Old Testament and Hebrew Bible are, sort of the differences between the two, the differences between the different canons, specifically the Apocrypha and the Septuagint. We'll have a chance to look at all of this and clarify any information that you didn't get from this lecture. And by all means, if you have questions, bring them to class on Monday. See you soon.